Hello, I'm Peter Junho Sang, founder and CEO of Beyond Form, and welcome to the special series Build It, where I speak to founders and their clients as to how they're building fashion technologies. This series gives you a glimpse into topics such as personal struggles, technical challenges, working in fashion, and more. On this episode, I speak to Brian Yurachek, CEO of New York Culture Club. Now, this is an interesting one because Brian was your typical finance guy on Wall Street, but decided to give all of that up to start his own fashion tech company. NYCC is working at the cross-section of IoT, blockchain, and wearables, which makes an interesting mix for potentially wiring how fashion experiences are delivered. However, that hasn't been plain sailing for him.
You spend a lot of time doing busy work, and it's not money-making activity. I call it money-making activity, right? So it's more of what you're doing just to avoid all of those other things. And if you're really honest with yourself, right, you have to stop doing that stuff and you have to call yourself. And even on a daily basis, I do that. Still, I'll get doing something and I say, that's not what you should be doing right now. Stop doing that. Go do something that you're supposed to be doing.
Let's get this conversation going with Brian on this episode of Venturing into Fashion Tech. How are you today, Brian?
Hi, Peter. How you doing?
I'm good, thank you. Looking forward to today's conversation all about fashion IoT, Internet of Things, in other words. But before we get stuck into the conversation, I just want to give some context to our listeners to open up the episode. So the Internet of Things, other words, IoT for short, in retail and apparel, the market size was valued at $35.2 billion US in 2023. It's a huge market, but for some reason it is still overlooked with the industry a little bit. It has a compound annual growth rate of 14% between 2022 and 2027, according to the platform Global Data. The application of IoT in fashion is varied, and it can mean anything from wearables within garments to retail experiences that use connected devices. In the value chain itself, it can unlock authentication, identification, and supply chain efficiencies. And over the years, we've seen brands like Burberry do retail experiences. We've seen Tommy Hilfiger creating proof of access protocols for their fashion shows. Recently, we've seen brands like Chloe, for example, authenticating their luxury handbags. We're going to dive right into all of those topics with yourself, Brian. But before we get into that, I'd want to know a bit about your journey. You come from the corporate finance world in New York City, where you're based. You left that security blanket, which of course is very, very difficult, especially for somebody with such a security blanket in finance, to build your own startup. Take us on your journey, how you made that decision to risk it all.
Yeah, well, it's a great question, and it's been a fun ride, but a challenging. The most difficult thing I've ever done for sure. But I think starting kind of way back when I was younger, I've always been a very creative person. So I started playing the drums when I was 7 years old, and I started playing music more professionally when I was around the age of 12, went to a military academy when I was 14 and had a music scholarship, kind of traveling the world playing music. But like most parents, my mom didn't want me to pack up and become a rock star. So I ended up going to business school. I was very interested in patterns. Music is obviously a lot of mathematics and patterns. So that was not too much of a shocker, but I ended up focusing a lot on capital markets and finance. So my master's degree in finance really shaped my goals to come to New York City in private wealth management. So I moved to New York and for the better half of a decade worked on Wall Street and managing personal, assets for ultra high net worth folks. Now in the middle of the pandemic, I had kind of an awakening where I wanted to go back to more of that creative tone and start to kind of reshape people's understanding of what was going on with a lot of different technologies at the time. So we had cryptocurrency, which led to understanding around blockchain, and then metaverse and immersive technologies. And I saw a very, very exciting time and a moment time. And I wanted to really take that whole creative field and mash it with that euphoria that was going on in technology right now, and what I kind of deem as more of a spatial transformation. So we went through digital transformation, and now I feel like we're going through more of a spatial transformation. So that creative tone that I always had in me gave me the ability and the confidence to match my understanding of digital rights management and some of these technologies, which I also did an enormous amount of research on. Spent a lot of time researching technology and really sharpening my pencil there to kind of marry that with my creative side. So that gave me a lot more confidence. But I also did, I saved up money and I did create a financial security blanket to kind of sustain. And that's something that founders should definitely think about. The jump lively could be a painful, course.
And what did that risk element look like for you? Because yes, you talked about the security blanket there, but it's still a risky business. You could lose all your money that you have saved up. What was your thought process going through all of that?
I think in some ways you kind of have to be a little delusional. And part of what has worked for me is that I don't always watch what everyone has done in the past, right? So I think in a lot of ways, it's very hard for industry professionals to get out of that kind of alligator death roll of what they always know. Same thing in economics and finance. We can get very caught in what we call bad pattern recognition, right? And you can make a lot of decisions and lose money in markets as well by repeating mistakes. And so, the fashion industry and textile industries as a whole are very wasteful, right? And they're very polluting towards water. That's one of the primary polluters. So I wanted to find ways also to alleviate us of those problems and use technology creatively. But I would say that there's something to be said for thinking more elastically and trying to approach problems with creative problem solving. And that's what I love about technology, is that you can have a lot of latitude to piece technology together in a very creative way to solve some of the challenges that we've been facing in the fashion industry and beyond.
And obviously, when you say delusional, you mean delusion in a good way. You mean entrepreneurial spirit. Are you still a rock star though at the weekends?
I still play music, but no, certainly did have to let, the 3-band kind of thing go. But I still play music. I definitely enjoy it. I have my drum over here and definitely do my rudiments, and I maintain a practice space.
Yeah. I was speaking to another entrepreneur yesterday, and we were talking about, okay, aside from business, aside from the startup, you do have to create that inner world for yourself just to keep yourself sane. And I guess that is your inner world, that whole music element. You mentioned there as well, obviously, you had to find your own path within fashion and textiles. It's not easy being an outsider trying to come into this industry. And I've been working with you now for a few months, and you are by far the definition of a New York hustler. You try so hard to get into this industry, get the network, get the right foot in the door. How did you learn so quickly to work in such an industry that is not very welcoming to outsiders?
Well, again, I think from coming from the arts in my past and having worked professionally with artists, there's definitely that similar kind of tone to it, right? So a lot of people who work in the fashion industry, artistic tone. So I think some of that made it an easier transition. But I'm just myself. I'm amazingly passionate about these things. It's very authentically me, and I don't hide that. So when I come into a room, I like to talk. I like to empower others. I like to talk about technology and what we can do with it. I as you know, I have microchips on my fingernails. So I like to start conversations, with people on this. I found that by doing things like the microchip on the fingernail or having physical demonstrations of this on me, just like a good salesman, it spurs good conversation, and I just authentically express myself with others, and I think that connects people.
And how did you learn so quickly, though, the tricks of the trade?
Well, again, I did research, so I think sometimes people think that maybe I'm even speaking kind of like out of turn on certain things, but normally I've done a lot of research on those particular topics. even if I don't have a huge background or a history doing that, I'll consume a lot of information, whether that's video information, whether that's reading, whether that's industry reports. I read industry reports. I try to make sure that I'm looking at who produced that particular article or video, trying to seek out credible sources for that information. So I check my sources and make sure that other professionals are getting their information in this industry from similar sources and looking at that same stuff. So research too. Yeah, it may look like I'm just winging it, but it's not.
So then for our listeners that don't know what New York Culture Club is, what is it and how did you come up with the idea?
Yeah, so New York Culture Club is a creative technology company specializing in IoT, like we said, Internet of Things, or in other words, putting hardware and sensors in physical fashion, merchandise, and accessories to help brands maintain a stronger data-rich connection with not only that physical product from a lot of different functional perspectives, but with the customer, maintaining a connection with the customer throughout the entire product life cycle. I started New York Culture Club off of kind of seeing what was going on in blockchain and digital rights management. So we're starting to better categorize, sort, track, and recall digital information, and we can link that to blockchains and do that in a better process. I thought, well, if we put a microchip in a physical object and then we linked it back to a decentralized blockchain, we could use that as kind of a digital certificate of authenticity, authority, right? And that can help us do some of those things like you mentioned earlier, better authenticate, right, items and know this is the Louis Vuitton handbag that I'm looking at, or quite simply with the sensors or the hardware, be able to tap my phone to that handbag and see the storied history of the creation of that handbag and maybe even who made it and where it came from and what materials were used. It depends on what the brand is really trying to put out to the customer. If it's all about sustainability, that might be a presentation of sustainability. So there's a lot of different ways we could create these.
So essentially, in a nutshell, it's about connecting devices of physical goods that have a microchip in it and then using software of some kind. So in your case, that might be an application, for example, to create an ecosystem. So it's essentially connecting products or physical things to the internet, which can then enhance the customer experience in some way. Culture is Code is NYCC strapline. Now, you and I have had so many conversations about your strapline previously. What does it mean and how did you come up with it?
Yeah, Culture is Code. It just kind of came to me at one point, but I love double entendres. So that's probably kind of why. But Culture is Code is a double entendre. So it means culture is literally code. So now with blockchain and different types of technology that we utilize, we're writing code to secure those connections that we just talked about. Culture is also the code that we live by, right? So it's the value and belief systems, right, of empowering people and creating better transparency and better information and data, right, to waste less and solve some of those other problems that we talked about, and creatively connecting that with people so that they can easily do that, right? So it's utilizing the code and the technology to make it easy for others to express themselves like that. So we want to create better models of consumption, essentially, right? Because if we just continue to mass produce, that's met with a lot of mass consumption, especially when we tailor the algorithm to just keep selling all that stuff off. And that's not very sustainable and it's very wasteful. And we know that, and we can put some of these particular technologies in place to waste less, but to also help benefit us in the process, right? So it's a win.
And obviously for the fashion industry, the entire industry is built upon the notion of culture. Fashion is about our identity and how we relate to each other. With a solution like NYCC, it has the potential to tell powerful and emotional stories. How does the technology, for example, help to create that storytelling moment?
There's so many, this is where we can get really creative. And this is where sometimes I get into trouble, right? We say, well, we could do this, we could do that. there are very specific things, right? So we talked about the ability to take a mobile device and interact with the garment and immediately get information, storytelling information. Like I said, this is where it was made. This is where it came from. This is who put the work into it. This is the story of the history of that particular method and process. But then there's very, very creative ways that we can actually have that physical product have sovereignty or speak for itself, or over time house its experience. So if we do utilize something like blockchain technology, we can assign, right, more certificates, so to speak, to that physical item as it goes to a particular location, as somebody digitally signs it, right? So maybe I'm in the presence of a celebrity and they can, tap it and digitally sign it, and then my hat becomes more valuable, right? So what's very interesting is we can now make physical products that we can turn loose on the community, right? And they can make it more valuable and then even sell it forward. And what's really cool is the microchip on the secondary market creates more fluid transactions, right? I know what I'm looking at, and I know that this is the particular hat that was signed by Drake and went to this concert and experienced this over the years. And so it allows us to actually embed that storytelling with chronological time stamping, if we really want, right down to the second, onto that item. And that's a whole new paradigm. That's a value add paradigm, right? Where the customer becomes a prosumer, producer, consumer. They're producing with the brand and they're consuming items.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting, because obviously when we as human beings go through events or moments and we, get those nostalgia elements, when we recall those events that have happened to us in the past, they can be very powerful things for us as humans. So I guess for you, Brian, as a New Yorker, what does culture mean to you as a human being?
Culture is the new currency. I mean, culture to me is its authentic expression of the self, but then when looking on others, it's seeking to understand where others have come from, right? So culture is kind of, to me, it's a two-way street, right? It's we get to express ourselves more authentically, but there's the respect for others' ability to also authentically express themselves back to us. And we may not always agree with those things, or those things may be foreign to us and they may differ from our culture, but we can seek to understand where somebody else is coming from and respect that exchange. So I think that's where some people get caught up is they kind of authentically express their culture, but they don't commit to, the full taking of everything back and respecting of everything else. So at least personally to me, and as a New Yorker, being kind of the melting pot of many different cultures, and having grown up in New Jersey, I guess I have a muscle memory, and it was very much emphasized within my household to respect other cultures. But again, it's that two-way street to me. It's I have the right to authentically express myself, and others may not always agree with that, or they may love it, and vice versa. And I owe others that respect. I try to arrive curious for others' culture. I'm very curious to know what others are doing and how they see the world.
But I think I'm getting the authentic you in our conversation so far. In terms of, just as a teaser for our listeners in this Build It series, we are going to be talking about other cultural elements as well. We're going to be talking about fashion and how IoT can intertwine all of these things. So do come back and listen to those subsequent episodes, and how Brian has been working with some amazing projects. But as we all know, projects don't necessarily come easily. If you are a new startup, you can have the greatest idea, but if executed poorly, it's not going to work fundamentally. So, Brian, what have been your personal challenges in building the foundations of the business? And what are those foundations that founders should be thinking about?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of moving parts. I try to stay very organized. I time block, right? So down to kind of just my daily activities. I try to exercise every day, and I time block. And then I prioritize certain items in that time blocking that need to be done on any particular day. So for me personally, that's how I orient myself, is I make sure that I'm maintaining sound mind and sound exercising. Time blocking, again, is a big thing that I use, and then prioritizing those items in that time blocking. Use others around you as well, in a good way, right? Mobilize people around you, get people into your cause. Even if you don't have the financial resources to mobilize people right away, people want to help. They want to get involved. They want to learn. Barter. Give people some of your, authentic self, or help educate others or teach them, and then they can teach you or help you with other things. So I think that there's definitely ways to mobilize others around you. If you even go into kind of local university or educational institutions, right? They typically have internship programs. So that's a great way to also leverage students in the local environment who are itching to get involved in these professional activities and learn more from business owners. I would say business development and focusing on what is your customer really looking for. So when you start going out there and creating sales materials or trying to bring customers in, I really try to put myself, especially being a creative person who can go many different directions, I try to put myself in the customer's position and say, what would I think if I got this email, or what would I think if I got this one pager, or if I were interacting with me? And I try to better orient myself towards what's important to that particular person. And that changes, right? So some brands really want to just focus on authentication. And if they have luxury items, that may be where they should be focusing. Other, streetwear brands may be much more focused on social e-commerce, right? And they may not care at all about authenticating some t-shirt. So there's a lot of different ways that you can kind of adapt and make sure that you're focusing on whoever is in front of you and what's important to them.
I think that's a really good point that you make, that I meet many new founders or, wannabe entrepreneurs, and you can essentially create a business without all the paraphernalia that goes around it. So quite often I see founders, they focus more on like the branding or having a website or the stationery or the logo, all of these things that doesn't necessarily add value, or the value creation process of the business at the start anyway. I'm not saying it's not important, but at the start, you can literally have like a one-page website and still do business and still make money. And I think a lot of founders do forget that essentially at the start, your cash flow is your lifeline. You mentioned earlier that you had your security blanket and you had your savings to help you get off the ground. And I do think that many founders forget that element. Or I also meet many founders that go, okay, I'm starting a business. I want to fundraise. Where are the investors? Well, business doesn't necessarily work that way in a nutshell. And I think it's a really good point that you make there. From what I know of you though, Brian, you can literally sell ice to an Eskimo. And for some reason, you still get projects and clients, which is amazing to see. And I think to be done.
You got to grit it out. And that's really where it comes down to it, is you have to be willing to do those short-term, push-ups to get to the long-term weight loss. And what you were saying is, listen, I got into a little bit of cycle of that when I first started as well. It's the website's got to be this and the branding's got to be that. We think we did a good job with that, but you spend a lot of time doing busy work, and it's not money-making activity. I call it money-making activity, right? So it's more of what you're doing just to avoid all of those other things. And if you're really honest with yourself, right, you have to stop doing that stuff, and you have to call yourself out. And even on a daily basis, I do that still. I'll get doing something and I say, that's not what you should be doing right now. Stop doing that. Go do something that you're supposed to be doing. Right. So
yeah, I completely agree with that. I'm a visual person and I love doing more of those visual things, but it's not necessarily going to make the money. So we talked about in the introduction some of the use cases that brands have applied over the years when it comes to IoT, blockchain, and so forth. In terms of fashion, what are some of the best use cases that you've seen so far that gets you excited?
Yeah, authentication is a really big one, because holistically, as I discussed earlier, across the product lifecycle, authentication to the brand is anti-counterfeiting, right? To the customer, same thing. That's the flex. They know that they're paying for the Louis Vuitton bag, and that's what they got. In the secondary markets, we talked about this, but when someone else wants to buy that, if they can tap it and authenticate it instantly, you don't need the real. You don't need intermediaries. You don't need to pay fees. You don't have to wait time. You can get a shipping label. You can send that across the country. Someone scans it, accepts the digital certificate of authenticity, verifies it with the bag, and you're good to go. The recovery or recycling fees or upcycling, whatever process we're utilizing there, it's compliance, right? So I say, I've got garment number, hash 14689, right? And I can say, this was originated on this date. It's now been recovered on this date. So for a lot of the laws and regulations that are taking hold in the EU, this type of focus is very important. So authentication being a really important one. And then one that we love at New York Culture Club, the customer brand interaction and the social e-commerce, right? And this is where we can be really creative. We have our Where to Earn program. So back in 2020, I think it was around April of 2020, I thought to myself, everyone walks around all day and compliments people on their shirt, their shoes, their hat, their glasses, their dress, right? What if we could put a personal point of sale in every one of those physical items, and I could be the shop owner. I could ring the cash register and take a few bucks out for myself every time, right? So this is that concept I mentioned earlier of prosumerism. I'm producing for the brand and consuming. And so with our Where to Earn programs, brands have the ability to lower their marketing and advertising spend way down. It's time to just do that and blast and hope for the best. And they can actually empower their best salespeople, their customers. They could enrich that relationship through a new value add rewards and loyalty program. And we can create this more sustainable solution where if my microchip is in my garment and this garment's paying me, I start to treat this a little bit differently. It almost becomes like the Uber that was once a car sitting in my driveway with my golf clubs and my gym clothes in the back. And now I have to put mints, water, and I have to get the oil changed and take care of it because I'm driving for Uber now, right? So it changes the relationship. And that's the same way that we're going to think about our fashion and items we care the most about. And that's kind of what we already do behaviorally, Peter. We wear about 20% of our closet, right? 80% of the time.
What you talk about there, you have luxury, authentication. What you just described there is kind of what we would call social commerce, that whole peer-to-peer, validation aspect and the whole reselling of items peer-to-peer as well. What about licensed merchandise? How does IoT fit there?
This is a fun one for immersive deployment or even safety measures. So for instance, if we take, a large sports league, NFL, right here in the States, so the National Football League, and if they started implementing these types of solutions in their jerseys, they could not only do hands-free ticketing, right? Because we know that 80+% of people at these sporting events have licensed merchandise on. So there's many different, as I mentioned, public health and safety measures that you could create alerts and different things to leverage against this. You could have people, again, hands-free ticketing, walk in easier. You could have way smaller lines because there's no QR code scanning in the prop, or I don't know where it is. None of that would happen, right? We could all walk through basically the same metal detector that they're putting everybody through, and your ticket would just hang off your shirt. If it didn't, we could just pull you aside. So there's many different ways that we can create in a post-COVID world as well, like less hands and interaction and healthier, safer interactions, quicker interactions for entering a particular sporting arena. And then again, when we're in there, this is where it gets a little wild, but we can geofence that time and we can have immersive media, right, that we experience. Or I could get push notified on my phone and say, go to the stand and get your free soda and hot dog, right? So many different ways that we can maintain a rich connection in real time with licensed merchandise at sports stadiums, music venues, all sorts.
A lot of the topics we're discussing here might sound far out to some of our listeners, but actually fashion IoT and IoT in general isn't new. It really came to the forefront maybe 15 years ago.
Absolutely.
But for some reason, fashion has not necessarily been that quick to pick things up, and it's still in that experimental phase in most cases. So why do you think that is, and where do you think IoT is then heading?
That's a great question, Peter, because RFID or radio frequency identification chips have been utilized, right? If I try to run out of a store, right, for decades now, there's alarm bells and whistles that go off. That's an RFID chip. That's saying this person crossed the threshold at the store and should not. So you're exactly right. This has been used for decades. in the form and fashion you're speaking to, yes, we've been connecting garments with mobile applications and things for actually over a decade. But RFID in general has been used in fashion apparel and track and trace, making sure, say, that the box that was sent from Peru is the box that arrived in Newark, New Jersey. And then what happens is that gets sent to Bloomingdale's, and then they put their RFID tags on it. And so there's actually a lot of electronic waste. There's tons of RFID tagging that gets taken on, throughout that life cycle, even up to the sale of the item. So we're also reducing an enormous amount of waste when it comes to microelectronics by just permanently putting it in. But I talk about all those things because it's kind of like what you said, Peter. This is not new in that way. It tends to sometimes cause barriers because people say, I've seen this before and I know what it does. And this is nothing new, Brian, and you're this new guy on the scene and you think you got things that we haven't seen yet. I do. And the food has changed at the buffet. And sometimes that's a moment, right? You have to tell people, hey, there's some new things here. I've got a microchip on my finger now. Just listen to me for a second, right? And in fact, these little things that buys me that moment, right? To tell somebody, hold on, listen to my story for a second, right? And so, but I understand that. And that's, I think, what gets us across that line is that I do understand the history behind this. And if people give me a second to talk through it with them, oftentimes they'll say, oh, wow, I didn't think of that. And you're right, this has changed. So it's just because it's so common or has been common in the past, we sometimes have those barriers or fear-based mechanisms that trigger when something.
So on that note, I just want to finish off today's episode with a quick fire round question. So the first answer that comes to your head, are you ready, Brian?
Okay.
Favorite fashion IoT project today, not related to NYCC?
Gosh. Favorite IoT. Well, Eighth Wall has been doing some really interesting things where they've been linking, I would say, physical spaces and times. So they've been using this link to like a skate park recently. They created a link physically to an augmented reality display of someone kind of skating.
Culture or code? Which do you prefer?
Culture.
One thing you could do again on your entrepreneurial journey to date?
God, I guess go back in time and tell myself that it's going to be very difficult and that's normal.
I think every entrepreneur needs to tell themselves, you on it.
I don't know. I would have made some different decisions. I guess this is the one. I would have made different decisions in the first couple of months with how I spent my time.
Real life fashion or metaverse fashion?
I like physical, but yeah, physical.
Best tip for budding fashion entrepreneurs?
Best tip? Don't look at what anybody else is doing. Just do your thing.
Thank you so much for your time, Brian.